Now, I happen to agree with the older scholars and think that the Qumran Scrolls are one collection, and that they did belong to the people who lived at Khirbet Qumran. So I'm going to go through that evidence for you this morning. Okay. First of all, let's look at where they were found. This is the cliff where Cave 1 was located. Everybody thinks this is Cave 1. That would be nice, but it isn't. Cave 1 is actually over here, one of the little holes in the wall. And this is Khirbet Qumran, the site of Qumran. Khirba means ruins. So here you have the buildings of the site, okay? And notice they sit on a plateau, okay? Some of the caves are along here, okay? And then other caves are here on this sort of spur here. This is the Wadi Qumran coming down here. That's where the site gets its name. And then if we kept going here, we'd get to the Dead Sea. Okay, so that kind of gives you a location. This is actually Cave 1. Okay, so you can see really that it's a hiding place. You can almost kind of sense that by looking at the cave, right? It would be hard to get in there. Okay. When the scrolls were found, oops, oh, I did that, sorry. Come back, there. Yes, okay. I'm going to put it like this, and hopefully that won't happen again. Okay, good. When the scrolls were found, they were discovered, some of them were discovered in these jars, which are called hole-mouth jars, hole, H-O-L-E, because they have a big mouth, okay? But others were just found lying on the floor of Cave 1. And this is a drawing of those jars. And inside Cave 1 was found also different types of pottery, okay? Oil lamps, cups, storage flasks, okay? This is Cave 3, okay? This is also a cave from the limestone cliffs. It collapsed in antiquity so that it really had to be excavated, but it would have been much easier to get into when the scrolls were discovered there. Most famous of the scrolls found in Cave 3 is the Copper Scroll, but the Copper Scroll is really an anomaly and probably didn't belong with the rest of the collection, but it's cool, right? Made of copper. And then this is Cave 11, the last cave to be found. Now this is a big hole, right? You can get in there. But again, a limestone cliff cave. So again, this gives you a picture. Okay. This is one of the original scrolls found. This is the scroll called the Rule of the Community. Now, I just want you to notice a few things, right? This is a scroll on parchment or treated animal skin. Okay, that's going to come up, so bear that in mind. It's written in black carbon ink, okay? And the script is what's called the Aramaic square script, okay, written by hand, of course, but by a trained scribe. And you can kind of tell that because the lines are so beautifully even, okay? And it really is a lovely scroll. You can see where it was damaged at the top, but it wasn't damaged that way when it was put into the cave. Okay. Now here's Qumran on this map, okay? And the 11 caves are all in this area here. But up and down this kind of ridge were a lot of other caves in which they did find pottery and other material. So again, an important fact that'll come later. And here's the interior of Cave 1. You wouldn't want to live here, but you might want to hide things here, right? And then finally, here is Cave 4. Okay, Cave 4 and Cave 5, and then Cave 7 through 9, which are over here, and then Cave 10, which is here, are different from Cave 1 and Cave 3 and Cave 11. These are caves that were made in the Marl Terrace. And notice I say made, because in fact, they were dug out of the terrace. They're man-made caves. And you can tell, look at the nice smooth walls. These niches are for lamps so that you could have light inside. Okay, a nice flat floor. Okay, this is a man-made entrance. It wasn't there originally, okay? But you get the idea, okay, of the difference between the caves. Okay, now I'm going to leave you with a nice shot of the scrollery and the original scholars working on the scrolls. Okay, here's my teacher, Frank Moore-Cross. Okay, but that just, look at that for a while and I'll tell you something about the scrolls themselves, why I think they're a collection. First of all, they're almost entirely Jewish religious texts. There are very few documentary or administrative texts from the caves. In fact, we can count them on one hand or two hands. There's about 10. That is business documents, okay? Everything else is a religious text in some way, okay? That indicates that it's one collection. There are no Greek works such as Homer or Hesiod in the collection, right? There are no Babylonian works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh in the collection. So it's very much a Jewish collection. The collection is chronologically coherent. Manuscripts are dated by their handwriting. Now, how can we do this? Well, if handwriting is done by professionals, then handwriting changes slowly over time, okay? And you can actually date the hands of a manuscript by how they form the letters, okay? So doing that, the earliest manuscripts that we have from Qumran date paleographically or by handwriting to the mid-3rd century BCE, about 250 BCE. Clusters of manuscript dates then slowly increase. They reach a peak in the 1st century BCE. Then they kind of stay like this, and then it drops off in the last quarter of the 1st century CE. Okay, so you have about a 300-year span in which all of the manuscripts were copied, okay? The collection is thematically coherent. The collection contains, first of all, the classic literature of Judaism. It's scripture, okay? The Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Manuscripts of the Torah predominate, followed by Isaiah and by the book of Psalms. Every book of the Hebrew Bible, with the exception of Esther, was found at Qumran. Okay, so that classical literature is all there. Another major group of texts is labeled non- or pre-sectarian. We don't have a better term. Sometimes you'll see apocryphal or pseudepigraphical, okay? But they're Jewish religious texts, just later than what we think of as scripture. Some of these texts, such as the Wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach or the Book of Tobit, would have been of general interest to all Jews in this period. Some, however, are more esoteric in nature, united by a cluster of specialized interests that set them apart from the rest of Judaism. An interest in the figure of Enoch, a solar or lunisolar calendar, the assigning of the priesthood to Levi, and religious law passed down in writing binds together the books of Enoch, Jubilees, Aramaic Levi, and other works, although they do not contain what have been labeled as sectarian characteristics. Finally, there are the sectarian manuscripts, which contain a specialized vocabulary, a particular legal stance, and a dualistic eschatological worldview. Works such as the Community Rule, the Damascus Document, the Hodayot, or Thanksgiving Scroll, and the War Scroll fit in one way or another under the sectarian umbrella. Finally, what is not there is as important as what is there. I've already mentioned that works from other cultures, Greek or Mesopotamian, are missing. In addition, there are no texts that are clearly supportive of the Hasmonean regime then ruling in Jerusalem, such as 1st and 2nd Maccabees or the Book of Judith. Fourth, the same compositions are found across the caves, with Cave 4 the largest cache of manuscripts, about 800 manuscripts coming out of Cave 4. Cave 4 acts as kind of the center point or the hub. Very few compositions found in Caves 1 to 3 or 5 to 11 were not also found in Cave 4. Major examples of compositions that do recur across the caves, aside from the books that later became canonized as scripture, include the Enoch literature, which is found in Caves 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7, Jubilees, found in Caves 1, 2, 3, 4, and 11, the New Jerusalem manuscript, found in Caves 1, 2, 4, 5, and 11, the Damascus document, found in Caves 4, 5, and 6, and the Community Rule, found in Caves 1, 4, and 5, right? So all these copies of different things are spread out through these caves. Scribal hands, that is, the handwriting of individual scribes, also recur across the 11 caves. The most well-known case is the scribe of the Cave 1 scroll that contains the Community Rule, the Rule of the Congregation, and the Rule of the Blessings. And so let's just put that up there again. Whoops, there it is. Okay, this is 1QS. Okay, so again, notice this scribe and his handwriting. Someone copied this, right? Okay. This scribe, this same scribe, also copied a manuscript called 4Q Samuel C from Cave 4. He made corrections to 1Q Isaiah A from Cave 1. He worked in the first half of the 1st century BCE, around 100 to 75 BCE, which is the date at which the Qumran settlement was built. And I'm sure Jody Magnus told you all about that. Other proposals of recurring scribal hands have been made over the years. A scholar by the name of Vanderplug identified the same scribal hand in 11Q Temple B and the first hand of 1Q Pesher Habakkuk. So remember, when I say 1Q or 11Q, that stands for the number of the cave. So that means you've got a scribe who's got a manuscript in Cave 11, and the same scribe has a manuscript in Cave 1. Recently, Eugene Ulrich has argued that the same scribe copied 4Q Isaiah A, 1Q Psalms B, and 11Q Milchama. By far the most sweeping claim comes from Israeli paleographer Ada Yardeni, who has identified one scribal hand in at least 54 manuscripts. These manuscripts come from Caves 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 11 at Qumran, and one is from Masada. They comprise scriptural manuscripts, general Second Temple Jewish works, and works that have been identified as sectarian or as belonging to the Qumran community or its parent movement. Yardeni dates this scribal hand to the late 1st century BCE, which is just when the Qumran community was at its height. 6, and finally, the material evidence of the pottery remains tie the 11 caves together, an identical pottery repertoire from the late Greco-Roman period is found in all the scroll caves and indeed in the surrounding caves excavated by DeVoe and others, in which no manuscripts remains were discovered. So I've got 6 ways in which this collection is a coherent whole. So we might call this a thick chain of evidence that affirms that the Qumran Scrolls are indeed one collection. Now, some scholars recently have said, well, okay, but we should look at individual caves, right? We should just take the individual caves and look at those collections and see if we see any difference. And there are differences in detail among the cave collections. Here's a very interesting one. In Cave 7, okay, only Greek manuscripts were discovered in Cave 7. What does that mean? Well, let me see if I can show you where Cave 7 is. Yes. Cave 7 is here, okay? It's on this cliff, okay? And so it was a dug cave, a man-made cave. And to get to it, you have to walk through the buildings, right? You can't, I guess you could scale a cliff and, but it wouldn't be very convenient, okay? So you have to walk through the buildings. So it seems as if someone from the community must have put those scrolls in the cave. And these are dwelling caves. That is, they weren't made for scroll storage. They were made for people to live in. And so I think that whoever lived in Cave 7 read Greek and actually had a collection of Greek manuscripts, probably from the library inside the community, that he had in his house, his dwelling cave that he was reading. And they were abandoned there when the people who lived here fled, okay? So while you can look at the individual caves and say, yes, there are differences in detail, none of them seem to me to refute the overarching claim that the manuscripts from the 11 caves as a whole form one collection. Another scholar by the name of Daniel Stuckel Ben Ezra has studied the manuscripts from Cave 4. Now remember, there were about 800 manuscripts coming out of Cave 4, so that's a lot, right? It gives you something that statistically you can study. And so he studied the paleographical dates of these manuscripts. And he found that the manuscripts from Caves 1 and 4 are statistically older than those of Caves 2, 3, 5, 6, and 11. So he said, well, what do we do with that? Well, he thinks that those manuscripts were put in the caves probably almost 100 years before the manuscripts that were put in the caves with later dates. He thinks they're one collection, but he thinks they were put in at different times. I don't think that's correct, and the reason for that is archaeologically, if you look at where the different dates of the scrolls were found in layers in Cave 4, remembering that the further down you go, right, the earlier things are, all the manuscripts are mixed together. That is, manuscripts from the 1st century CE are found alongside manuscripts from the 2nd century BCE. So it's hard then to argue that you have different time layers. But anyway. Okay, so I hope everyone's now convinced this is one collection, right? Okay. So if they're one collection, did this collection belong to the people who inhabited Khirbet Qumran? Okay. And I think, again, yes. Yes, they did. So what is the evidence for that? First is the archaeological evidence. The 11 scroll caves are part of the archaeological landscape of Qumran, right? It used to be that archaeologists just looked at buildings, right? Okay. But now they realize that people don't just inhabit buildings, right? They walk around and they go, right, all around. And so actually an archaeological site is more than just its buildings. It's landscape, the area in which it is likely that the people who lived in the buildings functioned, okay? And when you look at it like that, okay, all of these caves are part of the landscape of Qumran. And even the caves up in the limestone cliffs, which are farther away, are connected to Qumran by paths leading from the site. These caves are connected by paths, by staircases that are built into the cliffs, okay, and all kinds of other evidence that show that the people who lived here were going here, down the steps, around here, down the steps. In fact, here you can kind of see the remains of a staircase, right? You have to use your archaeological imagination, but that's what you've got, okay? And they're going into these caves, okay? The man-made caves are reachable only by passing by, okay, here, or through Qumran, and were constructed as work or dwelling spaces for the community. An identical pottery repertoire was found in the site and in the caves, okay? The most important piece of evidence in this regard is the tall cylindrical whole-mouth jars. Let's find those again, there they are, which are called scroll jars, which were found either whole or in pieces in every cliff cave and throughout the site, okay? So you go to the site, you find this type of jar. In fact, some of them are buried in the floor levels. You go to the cliff caves, you find this type of jar, okay? It's important to note that these classic cylindrical jar forms is found only at Qumran and was evidently manufactured there, since what are called wasters were found in the dumps. That is, when you fire a jar, right, it doesn't always come out right. And so maybe it cracks in the kiln or it comes out misshapen or something like that happens. And then what happens? Well, you dump it, okay? Well, you only find wasters at the place you're making the scrolls, right? You don't, the jars, right? You don't carry the wasters any distance. Why would you do that? So if you find wasters, you know they're making them there. Finally, the presence of a kiln in the ruins. There's a pottery kiln at Qumran. Okay, it's in this area over here. Okay. And the fact that some of the pottery was made of a local Dead Sea region clay indicates the manufacture and use of the pottery at Qumran itself. 3, evidence for writing and scroll manufacture was discovered in the buildings and the Marl Terrace caves. 9 inkwells, these are inkwells, were discovered at the site, although 4 are uncertain. So we can say 5 for sure come from the site and the time we're interested in. 65 ostraca, or clay sherds with writing, were found in the ruins of the buildings, of which 51 are in Hebrew. Although most of these ostraca are business documents of one sort or another, some are rudimentary literary texts. Khirbet Qumran 3 and 161 are what's called abecediaries, which is just what it sounds like, someone practicing writing the alphabet on a potsherd, A, B, C, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, etc. Khirbet Qumran 2207 is what's called a practical student exercise, containing a quotation from the Psalms. This evidence points to writing activities in the Khirbet itself. A stylus, reportedly from Cave 11, is part of the Skoyen collection in Norway and is soon to be published. Associated with the inkwells were plaster benches and tables. Now, Roland DeVoe thought these were writing desks. Their actual function has been disputed, but writing desks seem to be the best explanation so far. They were found in the same place with the inkwells. So that helps us think maybe they were used for writing. The manufacture and repair of scrolls seems to have taken place at Qumran as well. Cave 8, and Cave 8 is over here. This is Cave 7 to 9, so Cave 8 is about here, okay? One of the marl terrace caves situated under the esplanade on which the buildings sit contained over 100 leather tabs of the type used for manufacturing scrolls. That is, when you rolled up a scroll, you tied it shut with a leather tab. Well, Cave 8 had 100 of these. Now, either someone had a weird collecting fetish, right? He wanted to collect leather tabs, or he was using them to tie scrolls, okay? And the cave may have been used as a workshop. Further, leather in various pieces of preparation was found in 3 caves near Qumran, including thin pieces to be used as parchment, again pointing to the production of scrolls at Qumran itself. Finally, recent chemical tests performed on the parchment and inks of some Qumran fragments indicate decisively that at least a percentage of the scrolls found in the caves was produced or copied in the Dead Sea region. So this is when I asked you to remember, right? Parchment is treated animal skin, right? And this is carbon black ink, which is carbon mixed with water, okay? So the ink used to pen the Thanksgiving scroll was made with water from the Dead Sea area. Okay, it has to do with the chemical composition of the water. Okay, the leather of a group of uninscribed fragments from Cave 4 was also prepared with water from the Dead Sea region. Now, the scientists who conducted these tests are careful to point out that the location of the parchment and ink production is not necessarily Qumran, right? It's just somewhere in the Dead Sea region. The proximity of the caves and the site to the Dead Sea, the other pieces of evidence mentioned above for scroll production at Qumran, and the remains of writing implements recovered from the site make Qumran the most likely candidate for the processing of hides into scrolls and the penning of them there. It is important to note that the parchment tests indicate that some of the fragments were not processed in the Dead Sea region. A fragment of 1Q Hodayot A and 2 fragments from the Genesis Apocryphon were tested, and it was shown that the leather and the ink were prepared elsewhere, okay? They don't know where, but not the Dead Sea. They can tell that. This indicates that a percentage of the scrolls were brought to Qumran from elsewhere, something that has never been in doubt, since all the manuscripts dated paleographically to before the founding of the settlement had to have been brought in from outside. However, the fact that fragments dating from the 1st century BCE were brought into the settlement from the outside during its actual existence indicates that the inhabitants were collecting scrolls as well as producing them. Okay, so that's the archaeological evidence. And so once again, I'd argue we have one of those thick chains of evidence that enables us to answer affirmatively the question, were they copying scrolls at Qumran? And I say, yes, okay. The next questions, of course, are why were they doing it there, and who were they? Okay. Why were the inhabitants of Qumran collecting and producing scrolls? Who were they that led them to this activity? And so I'm going to argue that the Qumran scrolls bear the marks of being a particularly scribal collection. That is, a collection formed by and for the benefit of a community that included a trained scribal elite. Now, when I say scribal elite, I kind of mean like university professors, right? The scribes, especially the ones who had the highest level of training, the kind of scholar scribes, were like university professors today, right? They had to go through a long period of training, right? I spent 6 years after I got my BA in graduate school, right? This is the same for these scribes, so you might think of them that way, okay? And I'm going to argue, too, that that the Qumran collection functioned as a library, okay, and an archive for the Jewish sect that collected it, okay? And so I'm going to first start with the idea that that the Qumran collection is a scribal collection. Okay, first, it's multilingual, right? It has Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek documents. It was scribes who were trained in different languages. Even people who might be otherwise literate, such as temple priests, would not necessarily have been multilingual. The presence of only Greek papyrus texts in Cave 7, a residential cave, you'll remember that one, indicates an inhabitant, probably a scribe, with a particular interest and training in Greek. The manuscripts of the Book of Tobit furnish one specific example of bilingualism. 4 manuscripts of Tobit were found in its original Aramaic, while 1 manuscript is found in a Hebrew translation. The translation of an Aramaic work into Hebrew demonstrates the activity of a scribe. The language of the sectarian text is Hebrew, but an archaic biblicizing Hebrew, again indicating scribal training. The only literary document written in a more colloquial language is 4Q Mixat Ma'aseh HaTorah, which may have begun as a letter, so it would be written more colloquially, although it evidently became a treatise for study, as witnessed by its multiple copies. Second, there is evidence of scribal activity and interest throughout the collection. There are, of course, the manuscripts themselves, most of which were prepared by trained scribes and those who worked for them. The manuscripts continued to be worked on and cared for, as evidenced by the corrections and repairs that are now exhaustively cataloged. This, too, is the work of trained scribes and their assistants. Remember the guy in Cave 8 who had all those scroll ties. The scripts in which the manuscripts were copied are indicative of scribal training as well. The Aramaic square script, which became the common chancellery script in the Persian period, is dominant, being used for scriptural, non-sectarian, and sectarian manuscripts. However, manuscripts were also copied in the deliberately archaizing Paleo-Hebrew script, while the esoteric cryptic script used for sectarian texts is clearly a scribal invention. It's kind of like you need a decoder ring to figure it out, right? The contents, too, betray scribal activity. I've already mentioned translation, okay? But you also have the evidence of scribes working on texts, okay? Both scriptural texts and non-scriptural texts. That is, you know, they're editing them, they're updating them, they're passing them on to the next generation. So, for example, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy exist in the Qumran collection in both unexpanded and expanded versions or editions. The unexpanded versions of these books is reflected in the later Masoretic text, so that's probably the one you're familiar with. But the expanded version is also reflected in the Samaritan Pentateuch, right? The book of Jeremiah appears in a shorter, earlier form, which was translated into the Septuagint form, and a later expanded form found in the Masoretic text. The Psalms are found in at least 2 forms, one reflecting the later Masoretic text, another with a different order and additional psalms, and that's 11Q Psalms A. I think that the fact that 2 or more forms of these scriptural books were preserved also betrays an archival interest. The keepers of the collection wanted to preserve the older form of the text alongside the updated or expanded form. Lists and computations are also evidence for scribal presence. Scribes compile lists, such as lexicons, compendia of natural phenomena, and genealogies. Many lists were found in the Qumran collection, especially in Cave 4. There are simple lists, such as 4Q rebukes reported by the overseer, or 4Q miscellaneous rules. There are also lists that involve learned computations, such as the Mishmarot, the tables of the priestly courses, and the various calendrical documents. These calendrical texts are an especial provenance of scholar-scribe expertise. Cave 4 also preserves other kinds of extremely specialized scribal literature. The cryptic texts written in the Hebrew language but in an esoteric alphabetic script evince specialized training. Then there are various small fragmentary texts whose presence also indicates specialized training. These include 4Q zodiology and brontology, 4Q exorcism, 4Q horoscope, and 4Q physiognomy horoscope. Okay, these are the kind of things that people who aren't scribes really aren't interested in. All these types of texts are present in the Qumran collection, indicating that it was at least partly shaped by the interests of elite scholar scribes. In other words, some of the texts found in the caves are the type of texts that scholar scribes collected as part of their professional lives. Finally, as described above, the kirba and the caves also preserve evidence of scribal activity and, importantly, the training of junior scribes, and indicate that at least some of this scribal activity and training was taking place at Qumran itself. Some of the manuscripts corroborate this statement. 4Q 234, 4Q 341, 4Q 360, and possibly 4Q 338 have all been identified as scribal exercises. They're just little tiny scraps of parchment with writing on them. All of these manuscripts date to the 1st century BCE when Qumran was inhabited. It seems to me very unlikely, if not absurd, that these little exercises would have been brought to Cave 4 from outside the community. Therefore, these exercises must have been done at Qumran itself. All of this evidence shows that scribal activity was taking place at Qumran. In other words, what I'm saying is that there was a library, okay, and a scribal production center somewhere in the ruins of this building. Now, there hasn't been any place that has been absolutely identified, although these rooms here seem the most likely candidate for that, okay? Because this is where the tables and the inkwells and a lot of ostraca were found. No manuscripts were found in the buildings. So some people say, aha, that indicates they weren't copying manuscripts in the buildings. But you have to remember that there was a big fire, okay, at the end of the period of habitation, and everything was burned. I mean, the roof beams were burned. There's a huge layer of ash. So if there were manuscript scrolls in the ruins, they wouldn't have survived. So what do I think happened? Well, we know that in the year 68, there was a Roman legion in this vicinity. And they came, this is the time of the great Jewish revolt against Rome. And you remember, Romans didn't like revolts, right? They didn't put up with this, and they didn't put up with the Jewish revolt either. And so they sent 3 Roman legions into the country to suppress this revolt. The 10th Legion was operating in the vicinity of the Dead Sea, and we know that in 68 they destroyed Jericho, which is to the north of Qumran, and then they came down the coast. So Qumran's right in their sights. So, of course, the inhabitants would have known they were coming. And what it seems they did was try and hide their library in these caves. In the cliff caves, which were far away, and some they managed to put in jars to try and preserve them. But others, maybe as the Roman legion got closer, they just ran over to Cave 4 and piled in. And they took everything. They took their important scriptural texts and their important sectarian texts, but they also took these little tiny scribal exercises, right? Someone just picked them up and ran, okay? And they put them in these caves. And of course, they thought they were going to come back, but that did not work out. And so now, in 1947 and following, that's how they were discovered. So I hope I've convinced you that the Qumran Scrolls are a particular Jewish sectarian collection, but they are also, it's a sectarian collection shaped by the particular interests of an elite group of scholar scribes found in the Qumran community who spent their lives copying and studying the scrolls that they had there. And this collection is defined as a library that included an archival function. Thank you very much.